today's world, science and faith are portrayed as at opposite ends of the spectrum. If you are a true scientist, God is not part of your vocabulary. Most often it seems when scientists, revered and esteemed scientists, share their data and discoveries with a waiting, eager to know and understand world, these discoveries also have a secondary purpose of verifying the existence of no God. A recent example I just read, I think it was the middle of September. They found a new fossil in California. It's on an island just off the coast of Ventura County, and they've discovered the remains of an unusual mammoth that lived alongside some of the earliest known inhabitants of Southern California. Complete mammoth skull, tusks intact, exceptionally well preserved, and rare and of high scientific importance, said the paleontologist. And it's, of course, been radiocarbon dated to 13,000 years ago, about the same age, they said, as the Arlington Man from the same site. But that doesn't exactly mesh with the biblical account that the world is a little over 6,000 years old. But we know we hear these discoveries all the time. There are Christian scientists, such as the ones that work with the Creation Museum, others highlighted by Greg Landry, who did our creation seminar last year. So there are ones that exist in the world, but they're not obviously the norm. And 2 years ago, my employer, Insight Events, we did a simulcast, and it was entitled Science of Faith. So I kind of stole the title for this talk. And it featured renowned Oxford University professor John Lennox, New York Times bestselling author Stephen Meyer, and they are two of today's leading speakers and writers on the intersection between science and faith. The simulcast addressed questions such as, has science disproved God? Are science and faith really in conflict? Just how scientific are the claims of leading atheists? Does nature supply evidence of intelligent design? And it was really good, and it was very popular. Had a lot of Christian colleges, home schools, besides churches, host it. But these researchers and Christian scientists are far outnumbered by the typical modern scientists of today who unquestionably trust that a belief in science and scientific principles and rules is not remotely compatible with a belief in God. And sadly, according to a recent survey, 55% of American adults believe that science and religion are in conflict. And this same attitude can be found among young adults. They said nearly a third of young adults with a Christian background say churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. And a quarter of them think Christianity is anti-science. But that is today in our modern instant information society. But now we're going to go back several centuries to the 1600s of London. And Viv talked a little bit about what people used to think about, or the germs, and how in the Bible, kind of as he was doing his sermon, and of course I've looked over it because I had to look over it for PowerPoint. I was like, wow, this does really kind of mesh. So London in the 1600s was a general calamity. The streets were full of thieves and murderers and human waste. Death was everywhere. I know they said, I read that, of course, thieves, when you think about it, they didn't have lights, they didn't have electric lights, they didn't even have gas lights, I don't think, at that time. So pretty much, if you wanted to get around at night, you used a torch, fire torch. So it was very dangerous to go out at night because you probably would be mugged or killed. And of course, there wasn't sewer systems and all that type as well. So it was nasty. We kind of glamorize and romanticize London back in the day, but it really wasn't. Adults lived to about age 30. The mortality rate of children was unbelievable. And then in 1665, the bubonic plague moved into the city. It killed about 6,000 people a week. A week. In 1666, an unstoppable fire, the Great Fire of London, burned the city to the ground, so Londoners thought that the time of judgment had come. Because in the 1600s, atheism was unthinkable. And that's an important thing to remember. In modern times, people presume either God exists or he doesn't. But in the 1600s, nobody reasoned that way. So just as the common man believed in God without doubt, so also did a group of learned men called the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge. Big fancy term. But all members of the Royal Society had two traits. They were all geniuses, and they all had utter faith in the universe, that it was designed on impeccable mathematical lines. They thought that God was a mathematician, and we know he is. As such, he had organized the universe according to discernible mathematical law, which, if they tried, they could figure it out. So they set out to read God's mind. And most of what I'm sharing with you is from this book. It's called The Clockwork Universe by Edward Dolnick. And it's an account of their work and struggles to make sense of God's principles in the universe and his creation. And even though the highest math that I've had in high school was Algebra 2, when the book was talking about their mathematical discoveries, I was kind of laboring through it. This was a couple years ago. But nonetheless, I found it fascinating. The central figure in the book, who we're going to talk about for a few minutes, Sir Isaac Newton. Newton was a finicky, neurotic, off-scale, brilliant character. He seemed to be able to hold a problem in his mind, neither eating nor sleeping, thinking of it continually until he solved it. But science wasn't his only interest. Living in the dark and desperate times, like I mentioned, of the 1600s, he devoted as much or more of his time to studying the Bible. See, we don't hear this, do we? We never hear this. Newton owned 30-some Bibles in various languages and translations, and he believed that the heavens and the earth were God's work and that the Bible was as well, and it contained all of God's secrets. And so he continued the study of both, with the Bible being at the forefront. Then we have Galileo, the brilliant Italian astronomer, physicist, philosopher, engineer, and mathematician. And he had, earlier in the 1600s, discovered the laws that govern falling objects onto the earth. The universe, he discovered, had been meticulously arranged. So Galileo, Kepler, and I think Viv has mentioned him before in past sermons. He's a renowned German mathematician and astronomer. They had all demonstrated this, how the universe had been arranged. And Newton and Royal Society members were sure it was the work of a brilliant mathematician, the God of the universe. And so surely it must continue into nature. And you remember in Viv's earlier sermon a few years back on the Fibonacci numbers and all of how it continues on into the numbers, and the math continues on into nature, plants, fruit, trees, beehives. And so Isaac Newton and his colleagues concluded that to study the world was to ponder God's plan. To study the world was to ponder God's plan. So the primary mission of 17th century science was to set out and find the secret of God's laws in nature and the universe, hence the Clockwork Universe. That was their primary mission. It wasn't to do scientific principles and experiments and all this. It was to discover the secrets of God's laws. Of course, the one problem was that someone would first have to invent a new kind of mathematics. And that was calculus, which had a couple of different, I tried to get a definition of it, either the study of change or the law of motion. Faith was here last week, so I knew I was going to be doing this. And I asked her, I said, Well, she was talking a little bit about her classes and, that she hoped to eventually be a junior high math teacher. And I said, okay, I have a question for you, Faith. How do you define calculus? So, and I told her what I had, and she thought that sounded okay. But then she went into more terminology, and of course, I was lost. I did not understand all of it. But Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz was his name. He was a colleague, and he was later a fierce rival of Newton. They discovered calculus independently. So Newton invented it, and then Leibniz reinvented it. It's called the math of motion, or calculus, the way of understanding how fast, how far, how high. Then Newton used his calculus and experiments to show how an apple is pulled to the earth, and of course we've all heard the famous story of, how he shot the apple off the person's head, or with the bow and arrow. And so he used it to show how an apple is pulled to the earth, how the earth pulls the moon into an orbit, and how these pulls are the same as the suns on the planets. And this same universal pull, gravity, is everywhere, operates on the same math. The greater the masses of the bodies and the closer that they are together, the stronger the pull. So his discovery, God has designed his cosmos with greatest simplicity in the most efficient way possible. That was his conclusion. And I know when I read this book, and that's not necessarily, this author is not necessarily a Christian, and he's not necessarily trying to set out and prove all of that in his point. But I remember when I finished this book that I was just amazed at what he was trying to show. Newton, he would have wept with rage to know that his scientific descendants, so to speak, the scientists that came after him, spent their lifetimes proving conclusively that the clockwork universe ran even more smoothly than he had ever believed. A new consensus arose through the centuries, which we are familiar with now, all through our schools as well, that there is no place for God within that universe. Newton would have wept with rage. Isaac Newton's intent in all his work was to make Isaac Newton's intent in all his work was to make men more reverent in the face of God's creation. This is a quote from the book. His aim was not that men rise to their feet in freedom, but that they fall to their knees in awe. So Isaac Newton's work was a hymn to God's glory. We'll end with this scripture. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. And I have a feeling that Sir Isaac Newton read this scripture quite often, and that as he looked at the heavens and as he did his calculus and his calculations, that he could see the knowledge that God had there all along.